Bien, nous allons donc
So we're going to start this conference on the presentation of the final report of the BEA. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a few words on the organization of this conference, first of all. We're here in the auditorium of the Air and Space Museum, a place of great historical interest that I would invite you to visit. I thank its director, Catherine Manoury, who is here with us, for having made the venue available to us this afternoon. I also welcome our Brazilian colleague, Luis Lupoli, who was kind enough to join us and help in our relations with the Brazilian families. This conference is simultaneously being translated into English for the participants here in this hall, but also the families that are following it by webcast over the internet. The presentation will last about an hour and will be followed by a question and answer session. Only the journalists in the room will be asking questions, and these will be taken in French. We come now to the end of 3 years, more than 3 years, of an exceptional investigation. Exceptional, firstly, due to the international nature of this accident, with 228 victims of 32 different nationalities. Exceptional, too, in that it occurred at almost exactly the same time as that suffered by the Yemenia airline off Moroni, that also mobilized the BEA, but for which the investigation conducted by Comoran authorities is moving forward very slowly, unfortunately. Exceptional by the mystery that for so long surrounded the accident's precise circumstances. These were only known thanks to being able to read the flight recorders in May 2011. Exceptional by the intense media coverage that has surrounded the various stages in this inquiry, marked by several search at sea phases and the publication of 3 progress reports. This is the first major aircraft accident in the new generation of instantaneous communication. Exceptional, too, alas, due to the many breaches of normal ethical safety investigations practice, where with respect to the disclosure of the contents of a confidential working document or publication of a transcription of the voice record obtained fraudulently. Exceptional, finally, in the polemics raised and unfair accusations made against the BEA investigators, whose professional integrity and impartiality have been brought into question. I'd like to recall what is really involved here. That is a safety investigation conducted by the BEA. This investigation does not seek to apportion blame. That is the role of the judicial inquiry that is being conducted in parallel and independently of our inquiry. So each has their own role. So do not expect from us to pinpoint faults or responsibilities. The BEA investigation started as from the very day of the accident on the 1st of June 2009. From the start, priority was given to retrieving the flight recorders. Without being able to read them, the investigation could not have been conclusive. Only on the 2nd of April, during the 4th phase of submarine searching, was the wreck discovered. The flight recorders were retrieved rapidly, and it proved possible to read them in their entirety after having stayed for 2 years at a depth of 3,900 meters, much to the astonishment of aviation specialists. The precise circumstances of the accident could then be described in a new progress report published on 29th July 2011. The description of the circumstances of the accident in this report unleashed strong reactions in an emotionally charged context, indicative of the lack of perspective of some commentators. There was still a need to understand the reasons behind the pilot's actions, how the loss of airspeed indications alone could in itself have led to such a disaster. It is precisely this further progress made in the investigation that its manager, Alain Bouillard, will now describe to you. Ladies and gentlemen, just over a year ago, we presented the progress report number 3, which followed on from reading of the flight recorders. The report in which we described how the event occurred. At that time, we talked about a human factors group to try and understand the actions and reactions of the crew, associated with conclusions from the systems working group, the operations group and the maintenance group, and we were able to draw up the final report, which I'm now going to give you the conclusions, of which I'm now going to give you the conclusions today. To look back to the context of the flight, it was a regular, a routine flight from Rio to Paris. Takeoff took place at 22 hours 29. The initial cruise flight level was level 315 at cruise Mach. The route followed complied with that planned in the flight plan. On the right seat, there was the pilot flying. In the left side, the captain not flying. The second co-pilot was going through his rest period. The flight took place normally. The city of Natal was flown over in normal meteorological conditions, and the captain said that he wasn't disturbed by the storms that were forecast. Then at Salpu, the aircraft entered the cloud mass with slight turbulence, and at that time the pilot flying was concerned that he couldn't reach the 310 flight level planned for the rest of the flight, 370, due to the external conditions which didn't enable the aircraft to climb sufficiently. A little later, the pilot flying was implicitly appointed as the captain, and then the captain was replaced. The second co-pilot joined the cockpit and took his place, and the captain assisted at the briefing of the pilot flying to the second co-pilot, who'd just taken the position of the captain on the left seat, and he took place in an exchange on parameters where the flight conditions that were going to be encountered were discussed, with the possibility of turbulence due to the fact that they were seeking to go up to flight level 370. And at that time, the captain, after this briefing, left the cockpit. However, no strategy to cross the intertropical convergence zone had been defined. The co-pilot was in control, and we get to the point Oraro, and we are now going to visualize the flight path, a part of the flight path of the aircraft and the last minutes of flight. 2 hours, 7 minutes, 48 seconds, at approximately 35,000 feet, the cruise level. The flight was peaceful, stable. Slight turbulence was felt. The captain left the cockpit, and the two co-pilots discussed the strategy to adopt, in particular with respect to detecting echo on the weather radar, and the pilot not flying suggested that they deviate their flight path to the left, a deviation which was about 12 degrees. The slight turbulence encountered, they felt slight turbulence. There was a discussion as to whether it was possible to climb further, probably to try and go over the cloud mass. And in a few seconds, you'll see on the right of the screen appear the moment when the pitot probes are going to be blocked by ice crystals, leading to inconsistency in measured airspeed. At that time, there was a disconnection of the autopilot and a movement in roll caused by the pilot flying, and a reaction which was going to lead the aircraft on a climb path. The altitude warning sounded in the cockpit because level 350 had been left and the aircraft was going to climb up to an altitude of about 38,000 feet with a very vertical speed vario of more than 6,000 feet per minute. At that time, at 2 hours 10:55, the stall warning was heard. Several signals were made to the relief station of the captain, sent by the pilot not flying, to recall the captain to the cockpit. The maximum altitude was reached at that moment. The aircraft had moved into pronounced stall and started to descend with a variation of 11,000 feet per minute. The incidence, the aircraft angle of attack was around 40 degrees and will vary between 35 and 45 degrees throughout the entire descent. And then in a few instants, the captain comes in. That's the time when the captain comes back to the cockpit. And a few seconds afterwards, the stall warning went off. And then it started again intermittently due to the systems. And the drop continued with an angle of attack between 35 and 45 degrees and a vertical speed of between 10,000 and 11,000 feet per minute. That's the end of this animation, which showed that the aircraft didn't change in its angle of attack. I'm going now to explain the sequence of events that led to the accident. These are descriptive factors that have already been featured in the Stage 3 report that I think need to be recalled here, then to try and explain, give a certain number of explanations which can help understand the actions and reactions of both the aircraft and the crew. The first of these events was the temporary inconsistency between the airspeed measured after obstruction of the pitot probes by ice crystals, as you can see on this diagram below. The ice crystals entered the pitot tube and disturbed the measured pressure, leading to speed anomalies which led to disconnection of the autopilot, loss of auto thrust, and switch from normal law to alternate law, meaning that the aircraft lost its protections. The crew was warned of stall approach by a warning noise and by vibrations associated with stall, which we call buffets. What we do expect from a crew at this time? We expect that the pilot flying control the flight path and that the pilot not flying surveys, monitors this flight path. And once this flight path is stabilized, they identify the anomaly and they call up the appropriate procedure, which at Air France is the emergency flight with unreliable IAS. The second event in the sequence were the actions on the controls that destabilized the flight path. On disconnection of the autopilot, the pilot flying said, "I've got control." But his actions in roll and pitch were brusque and excessive and were inappropriate to high-altitude flight, especially with a switch from 10 seconds from a pitch attitude to 11 degrees. And I'd remind you that normally this should be at 6 degrees maximum, and the vertical speed became higher than 6,000 feet per minute. The third event in the sequence was the failure to make a connection by the crew between the loss of airspeed announced and the procedure, and the appropriate procedure. The crew announced loss of airspeed, but through the many messages that they were sent as a result of the airspeed anomalies, they didn't establish a link with the appropriate procedure. These messages associated with destabilization of the flight path were going to disorganize the work of the crew. The late identification by the pilot not flying of the deviation from flight path and inadequate correction by the pilot flying were part of the next sequence. Less than 20 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, the pilot not flying detected climb by observation and by reasoning. He asked the pilot flying to stabilize his flight path, to be careful as to his speed and to go back down. But even though these indications weren't precise, they were essential and adequate for a short-term management of the situation. This invention by the pilot not flying led the This intervention by the PNF led the pilot flying to apply actions which could have reduced the pitch attitude, which had not yet gone above 10 degrees. But despite the feeling of the pilot flying with regard to the objective of going down, the orders kept the aircraft on an upward path. But at that time, the flight directors gave orders to give nose-up input, which probably disturbed the pilot flying. The next sequence is about the non-identification by the crew of approaching stall and the absence of immediate reaction and leaving the flight envelope. There was an absence of diagnostic by the crew of this situation of stall, and as a result, absence of actions to recover the situation. The stall alarm came on at 2 hours, 55 seconds. It led to no announcement by the crew. A few seconds later, the propulsion ceiling was crossed and the aircraft left its flight envelope. At that time, bringing the plane downwards would have allowed the aircraft to come back into its flight envelope. But the position of the stick in a nose-up position continued to worsen the situation, and it's possible that the pilot flying identified a situation of overspeed due to the aerodynamic noise, the buffet associated in his mind with the overspeed, with the trend arrow of speed on the PFD indicating an action at the moment of activation of the stall warning. The crew never referred to either the alarm, which they must have heard, or the buffet, which they would have noticed. The aircraft then went into stall, pronounced stall, announced by the stall warning and very strong vibration. The crew never understood that they were stalling. The captain came back into the cockpit, having certainly heard the stall warning and felt the strong vibration. Neither was he able to diagnose the stall situation. At this stage in the event, only an extremely determined crew, having clearly understood the situation, could have attempted to bring the aircraft back to its flight envelope. Here, the crew was in a condition of almost complete loss of control of the situation. We're going on to look now at the combination of factors that can explain these events. These are related to the feedback mechanisms for all the players involved that didn't allow, through the events preceding, to detect non-application, recurrent non-application of the procedure relating to airspeed anomalies and to remedy them, and to ensure that the risk model for the crew in cruise flight included risks of obstruction of the pitot probes by ice crystals. They're related too to a lack of training at high altitude and manual piloting, and the procedure relating to airspeed anomaly indications. They relate too to the work in the crew weakened by the effect of surprise, and they were related too to the absence of clear indications in the cockpit of the inconsistency of speeds identified by the calculators. And there were many messages, but none of them really led to the appropriate procedure being adopted. There was lack, too, of taking into account of the stall warning by the crew. There was a failure to take into account, and this might be the consequence of the following events. Absence of identification of the oral warning due to the position, due to the lack of training in operation with the stall warning coming into effect and turning off. Absence of training as to identifying some stall entry positions, possible confusion with the risk of overspeed, where buffet is also considered to be a symptom. Indications from the flight director, too, could have encouraged the crew to follow those inappropriate actions. There was also difficulty in recognizing the implications of alternate law reconfiguration without any protection in angle of attack. 25 new recommendations have been included in this final report that cover lines of approach to improve matters. Firstly, training of pilots so that they have a better knowledge of aircraft systems, to improve their knowledge of systems and change their characteristics in the event of degraded or unusual situations. Improvement in practical and theoretical training to fill out their practical training and improve assimilation of basic notions of a theoretical nature as to aircraft performance and flight mechanics. We need to improve synergy between crew where there's a strong emotional charge, and to develop and maintain a capacity to manage the crew's resources. And finally, we need to improve representativeness of simulators to make them more realistic in abnormal situations through training. There are also recommendations relating to the aircraft systems. When it comes to flight directors, we need to look into their logic for redisplay and re-engagement after their disappearance. We need to look at the logic of display of the flight directors when the stall warning is activated. We need to study the relevance of information provided to the crew in the event of failure. There's a recommendation too relating to the operation of the stall warning, so that on approach to stall there be a dedicated visual indication combined with the oral warning, and for the stall warning to operate even in the event of very low speed. There's also recommendations relating to feedback or reports back. We need to better analyze operational risks and human factors when incidents occurred. We need to update procedures, upgrade procedures, and training. There's a recommendation too concerning the GGCA on monitoring the airline so that they improve their efficiency There are recommendations too on search and rescue operations, so that organization of rescue operations are improved at sea in particular, and one of the recommendations relates to air traffic control when it comes to accelerate implementation of communication, reliable communication, including within inhospitable zones. I've given you a summary of the final report, which will be published within the next few hours, in which you will find all the details. I'll hand over now to the director of the BEA to conclude this presentation. Thank you, Alain. The inquiry is now over. As from tomorrow, the BEA will be addressing its new recommendations to its recipients, and mainly to the DGAC, ASA and OACI. Amongst these new recommendations, there are 8 concerning training of pilots and 5 concerning aircraft certification. Some of the actions, the corresponding actions have already started to be applied. For others, we're at the beginning of a process of implementation which could last many years. The BEA will follow progress of these recommendations. To conclude now, what has this accident taught us? It results from the normal flight envelope of the aircraft being left through crew having lost cognizance of the situation, the real situation. This category of accident has emerged over the last 10 years or so, and they've been the most deadly in air transport. They've concerned conventional aircraft and modern aircraft with high levels of automated systems, as with Boeing and Airbus aircraft. The BEA is associated in a number of major investigations around the world and has investigated a number of accidents within the same category. It has also investigated a category of similar accidents still within the normal flight envelope of the aircraft, with loss of control of flight path due to a loss of awareness of the situation by the crew, where this led to catastrophe. We are now conducting a study into this category of accident. A lot of work and research within the aeronautical community is going on this matter of a lack of awareness, a loss of awareness of the real situation by crew. The conclusions and recommendations of the BEA on pilot training are consistent with this thinking. Automated systems are used on modern airliners over most of the time of flight. They have improved safety considerably. The problem is that we don't always use these automated systems, either involuntarily when they disconnect, as in the case of this accident, or voluntarily in certain situations. And then, whether it be a conventional aircraft or a modern aircraft, control of the aircraft or of the flight path requires from the pilot perfect understanding of the situation. And this results from the quality of the information provided to the pilots, from the way the information is presented, the consistency of the signals that they perceive through their sensors, and their capacity to give meaning to those signals. Clearly, we can increase the level of automated systems, we can make them more reliable, we can strengthen protections, but in the last analysis, safety will always be based, first of all, on a correct match between the pilot's cognitive capacities and the information that is given to them to understand and react. We're now going to move on to questions, and to answer them, I'm joined by 2 directors of the investigation, the managers of 2 working groups, Mr. Sebastian David for human factors and Leopold Sartorius for aircraft systems, and I'd ask them to join us here on the podium.
Voilà, donc j'invite maintenant les journalistes présents dans la salle.
So now journalists present in the room are welcome to ask questions concerning this investigation.
Monsieur voulait poser une question. Allez-y. Oui.
Good. One gentleman wants to ask a question.
Non, c'était ici. C'était ici d'abord. Mathieu, pour monsieur qui est là. Voilà, un petit temps de rodage.